Bonsoir, bonsoir, good evening. Please all take your seats. There are a few seats up front. A couple there, a couple here. It's a sellout. I hope you realize tonight. So bonsoir, good evening. I'm Louise Derry Goldberg, and on behalf of the Friends of McGill Library, welcome to the 2019 edition of the Hugh MacLennan Lecture, featuring award-winning author Esi Edugyan. We're all so excited. In conversation with CBC's Amanda Parris. This evening is made possible thanks to a very special friend of the library, Mr. Don Walcott, who is generously sponsoring this evening. Thank you, Don. And we're also grateful to a wonderful partner we've had for the last 3 years for this event, the Blue Metropolis Literary Festival, and you'll be hearing from Maître Bélanger shortly. Now, I know you're very excited to get our evening started, and I'm only going to take a few moments to share some very exciting news. You'll be the first, among the first, to hear about a very special renovation project with a cost of about $150 million to redesign and reimagine our library. This project will soon be underway. Now, you know, when we often say at McGill that McGill is like the meeting of brilliant minds from all over the world. And it's important to remember that that meeting of the minds often takes place in the library. The McGill Library is a vital component of student life and learning, and it is one of North America's greatest intellectual assets. In fact, there are many examples of collections at McGill that are nowhere else in the world. This includes more than 200,000 items in our rare and special collections, Osler Library, Art and Archives, also known as ROAR. I kid you not. The library, however, is at a critical time in its history. For those of you who remember in 1969, when the MacLennan Library opened its doors, McGill had 14,000 students. Now, 50 years later, there are 40,000 students. I think most of them were on the lawn this afternoon because the library, there's no room in the library for them to study for finals. I understand it's the last day of finals, so all the mothers there, please don't worry. The exams are almost over, I'm told. Now, I'm sure most of you know that McGill is getting ready to celebrate its 200th anniversary in 2021, and in conjunction with this, there is a bold vision to transform the library into a cutting-edge nexus for teaching, learning, and research in the digital age. New technologies have completely transformed how students and faculty use libraries, how they seek information, and connect with each other. The words inscribed above the entrance of an early library building, Fiat Lux, you might have seen it, "Let there be light." Those words reflect the goal of the ambitious undertaking that we have to create a new library complex that will accommodate exciting advances in technology-based learning, changing the library to meet the needs of current and future McGill students, faculty, and researchers. Fiat Lux is also the name of our campaign to raise the necessary funds. There is a leader in our community who has made a major commitment to this project, and along with others, we have reached the $45 million mark. It really is fantastic. It really is fantastic. Now, the people who've supported this share the vision of the Dean of Library Sciences, Dr. Colleen Cook, the Associate Dean of ROAR, Dr. Natalie Cook, and many others, including the volunteer board of the Friends of the Library. and I hope that you'll share this vision with us. It is such an exciting project for McGill and for Montreal. So if you can, please consider supporting Fiat Lux. Now, if you're here, I hope that you're all friends of the library. Now, if no one has ever asked you to be a friend of the library, I'm asking you now. Please become a friend of the library. There are many different levels of support. I'm sure you'll find one that you're comfortable with, from bookworm to even setting the amount you'd like to support. All amounts are appreciated. And if you are already a friend of the library, thank you so much for your support. Now, please join me in welcoming Maître Philippe Bélanger, a senior law partner at the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault and a board member of Blue Met.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everybody. As lawyers say, I'll be brief. For now, on behalf of the Met Blue Board, I'm very excited and happy to be here with you all for this Hugh MacLennan Lecture, and to be here with this very special author. Beautiful evening coming up, Esi Edugyan. Thank you for being here. Tonight's discussion with this brilliant author is the kickoff to this year's Met Blue Festival. We're very proud and thankful to be co-hosting this event with the Friends of the McGill Library. I want to thank the Friends of the McGill Library for having us on again this year. If you have not had the chance, our program is in front. Again, this year we have an extremely rich and varied program with a very strong emphasis on diversity, multiculturalism, social equality, Indigenous voices, and a special nod to celebrating the 50 years of Woodstock. For those of you with children, you'll be happy to know we have countless free literary activities for children, and you may rest assured there is no specific reference to celebrating Woodstock in those activities. So I invite you all to participate as actively as you can in this year's festival. It really is an extremely jam-packed program which the amazing Met Blue team has put together this year. Before I hand it over to Professor Blackett, if I may, because I'm not here only as a Met Board member, but I'm also here as a huge fan. So I want to thank personally Esi Edugyan for being here with us tonight. A few months ago, at a very cold board meeting in a cold boardroom, when it was announced to the board that she would be with us tonight, I could not help but yell out, "Ooh, I love Half-Blood Blues and Washington Black." And the whole board turned to me, and our very serious chairperson almost kicked me out of the boardroom for insubordination. So I was sincerely and instinctively extremely happy that I would get to meet her, and now I'm here presenting her, which is extraordinary. To me, without stealing any of the punch, what I find especially moving with these books is that it brings out the beauty that seeps in and exists even through the most difficult and trying times. Her fiction has allowed me, and I suspect most of you, to empathize and to better understand the lives of others through this wonderful fiction. So if I may throw back a beautiful quote from Charles Chippewa Jones, or Chip Jones, her wonderful character from Half-Blood Blues, when he's talking about jazz in Paris during the outset of World War II with his friend Sid Griffiths. He says, "I'll tell you what I know. The world's damn beautiful, but it's an accidental beauty. What we do, it's deliberate. It's the one damn consolation you can offer. Not just your own life, but other lives you ain't even met. Thank you for the deliberate beauty, et merci infiniment d'être avec nous ce soir. So on behalf of the Met Blue Board, thank you very much for being here, and have a wonderful evening. Merci beaucoup." I'm sorry, I should be presenting Professor Blackett, who follows me. I'm just so relieved to finish that I forgot. Professor Blackett?
Bonsoir, bienvenue. Il me fait un énorme plaisir, un honneur d'être parmi vous et de présenter les deux participants célèbres dans cette conversation tant attendue par nous tous et toutes. J'aimerais d'abord reconnaître que nous sommes sur le territoire non cédé de la population Haudenosaunee, un territoire qui a aussi servi de lieu de rencontre pour diverses populations autochtones, y compris les Anishinaabe. First, I have the honor of introducing Amanda Parris, who, over the course of her distinguished career, has worn a variety of hats. By day, she is at once the host, the writer, the playwright, the interviewer, and the speaker, when most of us have encountered her in the weekly column for CBC Arts as the host of no less than 3 CBC television series, CBC Arts Exhibitionists, The Filmmakers, and From the Vaults. And she's also the radio host of Marvin's Room on CBC Music, which I have the privilege to listen to by night. But for Amanda Parris, by night she is the educator, the researcher, the actor, and the community organizer. Yes, she writes stories for the stage and for the screen. She's the co-founder of the award-winning alternative education organization Lost Lyrics and worked with the Remix Project and the Manifesto Festival. She has written arts-based curricula and even dreamed of opening a school that Blue Ivy Carter would attend. Yes, as my 15-year-old daughter reminded me with her inimitable eye roll, Beyonce and Jay-Z's daughter. And in those extra times of the day and year that Amanda Parris apparently finds, she's a frequently requested speaker who's delivered keynotes at numerous summits and festivals, including UN conferences around the world. All of these accomplishments have come with great preparation. Formally, Amanda Parris completed her honors BA in political science and women's studies at York University and her MA degree in sociology of education at the University of Toronto. And she was a playwright in residence at Cahoots Theatre and Alameda Theatre and studied writing and acting at Be Current, Anit Africa Dub Theatre, and the Lee Strasberg Institute of Film and Theatre. But let me tell you a little about the other preparation, the learning in community. In a Broadway World Toronto interview in 2017, Amanda Parris spoke of her lifelong fascination with stories and the act of storytelling. She added that family functions have always been spaces of natural theater, and highlighted in particular her grandfather, who she referred to as an incredible storyteller. To this discussion of the spaces and inspiration for storytelling, she added the transformative experience, that is, the discovery of content that speaks one's name. For Parris, this came when she read the slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. It transformed her, and she wanted to tell everyone about it. So it's no surprise, but a cause for celebration, that in 2018, Amanda Parris was named one of Toronto's most inspiring women by Post City, a local hero of Toronto film, by Now Magazine, and the African Heritage Educators Network, named their 2018 Student Award after her. So please join me first in welcoming Amanda Parris to Montreal and to McGill. Welcome. So second, Esi Edugyan. So Esi Edugyan captured my heart in 2011 when I first read Half-Blood Blues. Here was a pitch-perfect jazz voice intimately telling the haunting, seemingly forgotten yet unforgettable story of Black Germans under the Third Reich. It was a poignant, painful, and yet beautiful truth-telling. Esi Edugyan would later write that when she is drawn to a story, she's compelled to see it through as honestly as she can. And to paraphrase Marina Edugyan, she just got it right. The Calgary-born Victoria-based author who studied creative writing at the University of Victoria and earned her master's degree from Johns Hopkins, just keeps getting it right. She's won 2 Scotiabank Giller Prizes to prove it, in 2011 for Half-Blood Blues and on the 25th anniversary of the prize for her most recent novel, Washington Black, in 2018. Winning twice is a remarkable feat. According to the Globe and Mail, it has been accomplished in the past only twice before by Alice Munro and M.G. Vasanji. Esi Edugyan is often described as an historical novelist, and she does work from huge historical conflagrations to find those people who are usually only seen in the shadows. She speaks of adjusting the historical record, dare I suggest, in the spirit of Sankofa, that she goes back and fetches it. She focuses, in her own words, on the fiction of her historical character's life, the man he was on the inside, those elements of what we are that are lost to history and recoverable only through storytelling. And yes, not only has she consistently centered Black men, she has spoken about the freedom and the latitude that this choice provides her. Be it situating the Ghanaian man in her first novel in Amber Valley, Alberta, where Black Oklahomans claimed land on offer by the Canadian government at the turn of the 20th century, or her most recent novel, Washington Black, which follows a slave boy into young adulthood from Faith Plantation in Barbados through to the Canadian North via Louisiana to Nova Scotia, the UK, and then Morocco. She's given her readers significant parts of our collective history back. And she insists that the stories we tell in our own voices are Canadian by virtue of, well, us. Esi Edugyan states that she has written about home not so much as a birthright, but as an invention. She's traveled widely and reflected deeply and poignantly on the distance between home as origin and home as belonging or not belonging in a place that feels at once familiar and strange in her book of nonfiction entitled Dreaming of Elsewhere, Observations on Home. Published in 2014 by the University of Alberta Press, Dreaming of Elsewhere is based on her flagship Henry Kreisel Lecture. In it, she evokes James Baldwin and imagines his reflections on a remote Swiss village in the middle of the 20th century, spoken softly by the young boy taken in 1707 from the Axum region of what became the Gold Coast and is now Ghana, christened Anthony Wilhelm Rudolf Amo in Germany, and who became a polyglot and a celebrated scientist before returning to a place of no return. Or the anonymous 21st century taxi driver in Toronto from Accra, Ghana, where he was a physics professor. Or Esi Edugyan herself, she writes, adding that home is the first exile. Esi Edugyan's writing is to invoke, well, jazz singer-songwriter Cassandra Wilson, traveling miles. As the Giller Prize jury noted with its 2018 award for Washington Black, Edugyan's supremely engrossing novel captures the way identity is sometimes a far more vital act of imagination than the age in which one lives. Home, then, is not simply a place, but a way of thinking and being, one that for Edugyan we leave in order to come back, changed, made new. Readers of Washington Black will sense the author's keen attention to scientific knowledge, her impeccable eye for detail, and her scholarly discipline. Like Hieronymus Falk, or Hero in Half-Blood Blues, Wash is a prodigy, one who draws and invents, but whose physical, intellectual, spiritual labor is not to be attributed to him. Esi Edugyan graceful meditation could hardly be more timely for a university-based audience. In her essay in the journal Boundless, she concludes, "If science is a kind of conversation, how much have we lost in the silences? Consider the depth of knowledge and contributions we lose when our understanding of excellence is not truly inclusive, that is, built on mutual respect and esteem." This reflection, flowing through Edugyan's urgently important work in this troubled populist moment, is a gift. For it's a privilege to be able to celebrate and learn from Esi Edugyan's excellence tonight. Let me close by adding that in addition to winning the Giller Prize, Washington Black has also been on the 2018 shortlist for the Man Booker Prize and a 2018 finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. And there is more good news. On the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, March 21st, we learned that Washington Black will be adapted into a limited 20th Century Fox TV series. And the University of Alberta has announced just a few days ago that it will be awarding an honorary doctorate to Esi Edugyan on June 13th. So please join me in congratulating and warmly welcoming Esi Edugyan to Montreal and to McGill.
Oh, wow. I feel like you need an award for those introductions. Those are amazing. Thank you so much. She went deep. She went into an interview that I don't even remember doing, and thank you for that. I'm kind of sweating from it. I don't know about you. It made me like, oh, wow, beautiful. So I was gonna do an intro too, but you kind of stole my limelight with it. So there's not much to add other than one important thing, which is that including all of these incredible accolades and all of these incredible awards, one thing should be known: the first novel was written when you were how old years old?
23.
23. As if she wasn't putting us all to shame already enough. Like, at 23, I was just thankful to have a part-time job at Athletes World, and she's writing a critically acclaimed novel, but it's fine. And then also, Washington Black, including all of these awards and all of these things, was put on somebody's favorite books of 2018, who is kind of notable. That would be President Barack Obama. And no matter how you feel about his politics, his reading list is always so good. So congrats on that one. Okay, so yeah, you guys can make an applause. You can just totally. So those were like the only two things that I had that you didn't already say. So I just wanted to bring those two things up. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm so excited to talk to you today. So I just want to give the audience a little rundown of how this is going to go. The two of us are going to speak for about an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. I believe there will be a mic that will be circulated around so that you can ask your questions. Please keep them to questions. And then once, yes, I can already sense that somebody might have a comment. And then once we're done that, Esi will be signing some books, which is maybe when you can say your comment, and I don't know, maybe not. And so she'll be signing some books, and there will also be books on sale, courtesy of Paragraph Books as well too. So everybody good with that? Shall we begin? Okay, excellent. So I wanted to start with our character, our primary character, and also the title of the book. Why did you decide to name an enslaved boy in Barbados George Washington Black?
Yeah, so I did a lot of research into slavery as it manifested itself in the Caribbean and in Barbados in particular. And I was really struck by the way some of the slaves were named and the names that they'd been given, which struck me as, they were just so ironic, and ironic to the point of cruel. things like Ruddy Christmas or, Thomas Jefferson, these kinds of grandiose or bizarre names that were meant to sort of, this great farce, sort of like an emotional warfare that's being, foisted on somebody, as well as the physical trauma that you're putting on their bodies. And so I George Washington, because, of course, him being the great founding father of the Republic, and somebody who went against the British and was really sort of had this great myth about him, that even somebody like Erasmus Wilde, who's English, he would have seen this man as being a remarkable figure. For him to give this name to a slave boy it's just extremely cruel. It's as though he's saying, you will never amount to any kind of greatness, and I can laugh at you, under the weight of this name.
I love that you use the term psychological warfare, because we don't really talk about enslavement or the process of slavery as that as well too. And I'd love to talk more about that a little bit later. But first I wanted to ask you about the inspiration behind this book. So I read that one of the triggers or inspirations was the historical Tichborne case. So it's a case that captivated Victorian England in the 1860s and 1870s and was one of the longest running criminal trials in British history. So can you give us a bit of the Coles notes on it and explain how this story about this mysterious disappearance of an Englishman evolved into a novel about a young boy enslaved on the island of Barbados?
Yeah, so it's, I'll try and keep it very short because I have a tendency to, it's such a long,
well, you also spent so much time researching it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So back in, I guess, the 1860s, there was a young man called Roger Tichborne, who was the heir to a baronetcy. He came from a very wealthy family in the south of England. And he went on a bit of a pleasure tour, basically touring the world on these sort of massive vessels. And he was shipwrecked off the coast of Brazil and presumed dead. There were no survivors. But his mother she was very close to him. And of course, any mother, would be filled with grief, but she sort of, this was the end of her world. And she was determined that, he was not dead. So she consulted a clairvoyant, and the clairvoyant told her that, in fact, she was right. And her son had survived, and he was living in a very sunny, far-off land, and she just had to, put some effort into finding him. And so she placed notices in papers all around the world and got a response from a lawyer in a small town called Wagga Wagga in Australia. And he said, your son, we saw the ad in the paper, and I realized that this resembled a man I knew, and so he said, I found your son, and he's living in this town, and he has been working as a butcher for the last 3 years, but he's ready to come home and take up his position and his title, and also his wealth. There was also a letter enclosed from Roger Tichborne, which was filled with spelling errors, and ended with a request for £400 sterling to be mailed right away to settle some debts. And she was overjoyed to receive this letter and immediately knew that this was her son. But just in case it wasn't, she recalled that one of the family servants had retired to Sydney, Australia, and was making a life there. And so she thought, it wouldn't be too much trouble to ask him to go and make the identification of her son. And the man in question was called Andrew Bogle, and he had worked for 40 years first as a page boy, and then as a valet for one of the members of the Tichborne clan, who had passed away. And after his master died, he went and decided to try his hand at a new life in Australia, which he ended up being very unhappy about and really wanted to return to England, but was too poor to pay for the passage back, which might explain why when he did see Roger, who, the Roger that he'd known in his youth was a very slender man, 6'3", spoke 6 languages, a great huntsman, kind of sickly, very thin man. Tom Castro, who was the man who'd written from Australia, from Wagga Wagga, saying "I'm your son," was about 300 pounds and about 5'10", and didn't speak any other languages but English, which he spoke very poorly. But he said, "No, this is Roger." Then the two of them traveled back to England to try and and set this man up with his rightful inheritance. And so I was going to tell the story of the Tichborne claimant through the eyes of Andrew Bogle.
Because this all ended up going to court.
It goes to court,
Yeah.
and Bogle is basically the key witness for the defense. And as I was writing this novel, in that iteration of it, I realized that I was much less interested in all of the crazy details of all of the endless trials, which went on for nearly 30 years. It was like 30 years of litigation. There were suits and countersuits and, eventually a perjury trial because it was determined that Castro was not Roger Tichborne, surprise. But there was just so much material there, and it was hard to grasp. And I realized that I was much more interested in the psychology of a person like Bogle, rather than Bogle himself, who had been living this very hard life, this unfathomably difficult and cruel existence that he was very harsh, and he would have had a sense of his life as being something very finite and very confined, and that he would basically die on the plantation, and probably prematurely. Like, this would have been his whole framework for his sense of his own life. So for him to be suddenly wrenched out of that and then placed into worlds that he could scarcely have imagined, just months earlier, I thought that's really interesting. And that was my true material.
That's so interesting, the journey that you took with it. You talk about the cruelty of being enslaved, and this novel quickly establishes how brutal and how dehumanizing it was to be Black on a slave plantation in 19th century Barbados. So I came into this book being reminded of a lot of the classes that I took in my undergrad degree. I got the opportunity to study the history of slave plantations in university, and what a lot of us don't realize, because so many of the images in North America that we have of slavery is from the United States, is that it was a very distinct experience in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and some historians have argued that it was much more brutal. Why did you select Barbados as the opening scene for this novel?
It came directly out of the source material. Andrew Bogle was a slave at Hope Plantation in Jamaica. And so it seemed to me, that I was very much going to focus on Caribbean slavery as opposed to American slavery, which is, as you said, sort of developed in its own way. It's its own distinct thing. But I ended up looking at Barbados specifically just because I found some amazing source material that was very specific in the details of what a slave's life, a slave's day would have looked like on a very minute level, and also just details of setting, different plants, how the soil smelled, just these things that are inimitable and concrete and so necessary to getting right in a book. So if you have source material that's very clear on those details, you run with it.
Did you end up going to Barbados?
I didn't,
No?
actually.
Oh, so you have yet to go.
I've yet to go.
Wow, that's going to be interesting when you finally do get to travel there. Can you talk about why it was important to emphasize the hatred and the violence that was inherent to this institution in such graphic detail?
Yeah. I realized that in writing the novel and structuring it the way that I've done, which is essentially most of the brutality is sitting in that first quarter of the book. It's the first thing that a reader confronts when they open the pages of the book. And I recognized that that was something that might turn some readers off, that this kind of, to shock load or put all of the hardship at the front is something that, the reader really has to trust you and trust that you're going to take them through it and that it's there for a reason that they will get through it. But I felt it had to be there because the more I delved into the histories of these people's lives, the more I felt like I certainly hadn't understood before, what a slave's day on a particular plantation would have looked like from morning to night. And I mean, I think everybody has a general sense of, especially from movies, but it's mostly, about American enslavement. But we have like a general, very murky idea of what it meant to be a slave. But I think those granular details of what it was actually like and the randomness of some of these punishments and the just the madness of them and the kind of bizarre the lengths that certain people went to mete out these punishments on black bodies. It just defied credulity. And for me, it was important to depict that in as honest a way as possible, to honor those lives, and also not to it's not something to be glossed over, right? It's that would be, I think, just so dishonest and just dishonoring those lives. So it had to be there.
I feel like one of the most devastating experiences that I had while reading the novel was not just thinking about the physical violence, but also the emotional violence of the entire experience and the mental limitations that are required to be a slave. It means limiting your desires, your dreams, your ambitions, and how small your world gets, which you already kind of mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about the emotional journey that you went on researching all of this and then trying to imagine this world into the novel?
Yeah, it was.
I feel like it'd be heavy.
It was very heavy. Yeah, there were days when I would just have to, leave my desk and go for a walk, or shut the book and just tell myself, you don't have to get through all of this material today, just because obviously it's extremely upsetting to be researching this for hour after hour, for a year. It was hard. It was really hard, and it was hard not to take that kind of fury and anguish, into your personal life. But it's something that you do as a writer have to set aside and leave at your desk or attempt to leave at your desk. It was not joyful material. Certainly researching the parts about the marine life or just some of the historical science with the hot air ballooning, that was much more pleasurable.
I forgot to ask this at the beginning, but who here has not yet read the book?
Oh, well, okay.
So I'm just gonna let you know, there are spoilers coming. I'm sorry, it's been out for a while, you should have read it. But now that you haven't, you will now get hints of what is to come. So you've talked a lot in interviews about the relationship between one of the characters named Titch and Washington. So Titch, for those that don't know, is the brother to Erasmus Wild, who is the the owner of the slave plantation, and he is the brother, and he requests an assistant to help him in some of the work that he's doing. And their relationship is very, very complicated. We'll get to them eventually. There's a lot of attention that's been spent on their relationship, but I felt while I was reading it that the most tragic relationship in the novel was actually that between Washington and Big Kit. And Big Kit, well, I just want you to talk about Big Kit for a minute because I feel like she doesn't get enough attention, and I would love to know about who or what inspired this particular character.
Big Kit was actually the first character that I started writing when I approached this material. I just had this idea of this, this woman who was very physically powerful and somebody who Washington ultimately turns to for knowledge about the greater world because she's a slave woman and she's a saltwater. So that means that she was born obviously in Africa, and she had been transported, and so she had some greater sense of the world than his small knowledge of it. And so she seems all-powerful to him. She acts as his protectress when he ends up being kicked out of the one hut he was living in and gets transported into hers. And it's like a mother-son relationship. She's, his first sense of being nurtured comes from this woman. And it feels very random to him. Like, he doesn't understand why she's decided to take him under her wing, but he's happy for, the first stirrings of love that she allows him to have and to express. But I was interested in her because she does seem all-powerful. Like, she's very physically, she's got a lot of presence. She's a large woman. She's a tall woman. She's an aggressive woman. All of the other slaves on the plantation are afraid of her, and she makes her power known. But that she's ultimately somebody who has no power, really. Like, that she's, beyond the confines of their tiny society, she is utterly powerless to determine both her fate and his. And so there's a great sadness in that. And when he's, I guess, ultimately taken away from her, in that he's taken to live in the quarters of Christopher Wilde.
A.k.a. Titch.
Titch. There's, obviously Titch has saved him from a certain fate, but he's also wrenched him away from his only source of love. And there's a great sadness in that.
So as was mentioned in the introduction, I was introduced to slave narratives when I was in high school, and I started reading a bunch of them. And most traditional slave narratives, meaning the ones that were written by people who were enslaved, end at the point of freedom. That's kind of the final chapter. But this story keeps going to problematize what it means to be Black and to be free. Why was this important for you to explore?
I think I've always been attracted to the aftermath, like what happened after. In Half-Blood Blues, the question was, I'd known that there had been, I guess, this small group of Black children who were born between the wars. And so I thought, what happened to these children, when the Third Reich was ushered in, and how were they, how were their whole lives prescribed by these laws, and were they subject, to these laws and to race laws, and I really wanted to look at that, and also what had happened to the jazz musicians who had had a great time playing in the Weimar years in Germany, and once the Third Reich came into power, what did their lives look like, and did they return to America, and could they return? Those were some of the questions. And in this case, I was very interested in what would it mean to have a kind of physical freedom, a bodily freedom, but, and be out in the world as a free man, but to still be carrying all of the ghosts and the baggage of that other life, because certainly, I mean, freedom doesn't start when somebody takes the shackles off. You've still got a lot to process and to understand. And even, even as free men, obviously there were still a lot of laws in place to limit and curtail those freedoms that had been newly given to you. Laws against, being able to pass freely through society, laws against restricting voting, laws that just curtailed so many of the freedoms that you were supposed to have. So I was interested in exploring, what happened after.
I mean, this is a historical setting, but that question of what it means to be Black and free, I feel like in order to explore what it doesn't mean, or where you don't find the freedom, means kind of defining what the freedom is. And so I was just wondering if you felt like you had an understanding, even today, of what it means to be Black and free, or is that something that we're still seeking? Which is kind of a big question and wasn't on my list, but now I'm thinking about it.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to explore within the novel was this idea that, Washington doesn't really know what it means to be free, when he actually becomes free. His notions of freedom have all been derived from something very basic that he'd been told from Big Kit early on, which was that freedom is essentially freedom from things like, human entanglements and the freedom not to work. If you don't feel like working, you just throw down the shovel, and the freedom not to answer questions that you don't want to answer, just these very basic, rudimentary ideas of what it means to possess freedom. And as he actually goes out into the world and matures into a kind of manhood, he realizes that whole framework it doesn't work for him. That freedom is so much more complicated than these very basic ideas that she's given him. And so I would say that the whole novel is like him groping his way towards, first of all, establishing what freedom is for him, and how much he's going to be allowed to express his own ideas in the world, and how much people will respond to those, and how able he's going to be to pass freely through society as a Black man who's also disfigured. He has a facial disfigurement. Just so many different layers for him of what it means to be free. And I think by the end of the book, he's resolved some of his notions of what's available to him, but he still doesn't even really know what that is and where that's going to take him.
He might not have known, but did you know what that freedom should look like?
I think we all have a sense of what freedom should look like for everybody, and that it should be a democratic principle. But I think, just going back to your comment about what does it mean to be Black and free today, I think that, I was asked recently about, I guess a few years ago, about whether I felt that we were living in a post-racial society. And
People still ask that question?
Ago.
Okay,
yeah,
I was like, come on, guys.
This was before,
okay.
Trump. But, even then I thought, this is a kind of a ridiculous question, because I don't think we will ever live in a post-racial society. James Baldwin has this beautiful quote about how being Black essentially means that you're constantly defined by others' perceptions of who you are within your physicality and in your skin, and that this is something that's enduring, and that I think will always be with us.
Okay, back to the actually written questions. So, for those that don't know, the slave narrative is also combined with these, in my view, it's almost the fantastical elements, you know, these kind of beautiful things like flying in a hot air balloon and marine life and unexpected locations as Wash ends up traveling the world on these epic adventures. When did you realize that you wanted science and discovery to become a key part of his story?
It just kind of was very organic, and I don't think it was a consciously made decision. I knew that he was somebody who was exceptional and who would have a hard time being allowed to express that excellence as he went out into the world. And I guess it seemed like a natural thing to follow the fact that Christopher Wilde was a man of science, and he's being taken to live in, this is Titch, his full name is Christopher Wilde, but Wash is being taken to live in Titch's quarters, and so it seemed to only follow that he would be picking stuff up and also recognizing that he has a great natural ability and affinity for depicting marine life, and it just went from there.
Nice. I'd like to invite you to read a passage from the book.
Sure.
Which I actually specifically asked for this passage, so just full disclosure.
If Titch kept one store in plenty in his lodgings, it was paper. He was a kind of maniacal proprietor of papers, and would return from Bridgetown some afternoons with large crates packed full of it. And so, there being no short supply, he provided me with a new ream each week and a fine black drawing lead, and instructed me to practice my letters. I would retire to my room, my stub of candle burning down, and in the vague orange pool of light, I began, then, to draw. I felt something vital, some calming thing go through me as I worked. Almost from the first, it seemed a wonder to me, less an act of the fingers than of the eyes. I drew whatever I had at hand and studied the ways shadows created a sense of weight, working without method or training. And yet I was careful to roll the finished drawing into a narrow cone each night and to hold it over the flame that it might burn down to ash. For I feared to think of what my master might do, to learn of my disobedience. But no secret can be kept for long. It is one of the truths of this world. One evening, Titch intruded upon my labors, just as I was holding a page to the candle flame. Frowning irritably, he asked, "Why do you waste that paper, Washington? Your letters cannot be so wretched as that. Let me see." My heart was in a twist. Titch, with his sunburnt face, his hawkish nose peeling, slowly opened my soft fist. I did not resist him. And there it was, the sunlight-speckled wings of a butterfly that we had observed earlier that day. Titch stared at the picture. "I sorry, Titch, sir," I mumbled, terrified. Titch did not look at me. "Cassius blue," he said quietly. "But did you really draw this, Washington? God alive, rarely have I seen nature so faithfully rendered." He peered down at me, looking almost stricken. "You are a prodigy, truly." My face flushed with heat, and I looked away. The following afternoon, as we set out into the canopy of trees to examine a small wooden cage that he had built for snails, he paused and drew me up short. He reached into his burlap satchel and fetched the packet of drawing leads, the carefully bound illustration boards. "I nearly forgot," he said, with deep seriousness in his voice. "Here is the lot. Do not break them. You will be the chief illustrator from now on. Be faithful to what you see, Washington, and not to what you are supposed to see. Do you understand me?" The hot rim of the bucket I sat on was biting into my thighs, and I stood, nodding, though I did not comprehend the full weight of his meaning in those days.
Thank you. So I asked you to read that passage because one of the things that really hit me in my heart as I was reading this book was about Wash's journey in self-actualization and self-expression, and also his keen eye for scientific observation and invention. It was at once beautiful to imagine and also tragic to realize how much untapped and unrealized talent the entire world lost out on by enslaving generations of Black folks. Why was this scientific acumen and this creative expression important for you to include in the story?
Well, it's just as you said. I think when you set out to write a novel, you're not entirely sure what it is you're writing, what your central issues are, these kinds of things. But, somewhere around the third or fourth draft, you should have some idea of what it is you're marching towards. And I was very interested in this idea of lost potential and lost excellence, because we so often talk about, when we're speaking of slavery, we talk about the loss of Black bodies, and for some reason, not so much about the loss of talent, that obviously took place. And so I really wanted to emphasize that, to emphasize Black genius, because this is something, as I said, that's stanched from the record. And also I was asked to write a piece about Black scientists, and I ended up doing some research into that and recognized that there were so many things that had been invented by Black people that, where we didn't realize the inventors were Black, or where, the particular scientist had been stanched from the record of having, given us this marvelous thing. And so that was interesting for me as well. And also these themes do play into the book.
It feels like Black genius runs through a few of your works. Yeah. Was that conscious, or is it something that just keeps coming out? Like, world, you must see us.
I think the latter. Yeah, it was never a conscious decision to make that my project, but yeah, it's been pointed out.
Historically, slave narratives, when they were published, were used as a tool to encourage white people to join the abolitionist cause. And because white folks were the intended audience, each narrative always included a white savior who helps the enslaved person to escape. Whether or not that was actually true is debatable. So this character was essential because it helped the audience to envision the role that they could play in the abolitionist movement. So in this novel, Washington Black explores a transformative but very complicated relationship with Titch. Through that relationship, you really question and problematize the idea of the savior. What were the nuances that you wanted to explore between the characters of Wash and Titch?
Yeah, so Titch was difficult to write and to get right because he has to be at once sympathetic, but also terribly flawed, and somebody who in the end seems as though he's betrayed his own ideals. And so it was a very fiddly thing that required several drafts to get that character right, and his relationship to Washington to read correctly. But I really was bucking against this idea of the white savior. This man, this heroic man who comes in and saves the slave and
Played by Brad Pitt, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
Kidding.
I really wanted to complicate these ideas of what it meant to even be an abolitionist, having come across a few narratives where it's this really fascinating one in this book by Eric Foner, I think it's called The Underground Railroad, so a history of the Underground Railroad in America, in which he talks about the fact that there had been a Quaker meeting, because the Quakers were great abolitionists. They had this meeting in which they were discussing the plight of the Black slave and what could be done, and there were 4 black people in attendance, sitting, but they were made to sit sort of away from the real group discussing the real issues, and they were not asked to talk.
We don't need your experience here.
Yeah, exactly. And so I found that very striking, and I really wanted to create a character who embodied that dichotomy, like this ferociousness of purpose, and a sense of doing good in the world, but who really forgets that there's a human being, or that there are human beings who are living this, and maybe doesn't even want to look at the details of those lives, just wants to have a great sense of purpose. And so that's where Titch emerged from.
So the character of Titch kind of reminded me of many liberal-minded white people of today who have the basic principles down, but as you said, with the details, it gets a little hazy. And so Titch is very progressive, but as you mentioned, there are limitations. When you were writing Titch, were you thinking about that of today, or am I just projecting my current perspective onto your character? Was it a commentary for today's sort of white liberal-minded folks that miss out on the details?
Like that's in there, and it was something that I was thinking about, but I will also say that I think all historical literature is like a commentary on what's going on today. Like it emerges out of the societies in which it's written. And so that criticism can't help but be inherent just because of this historical precedent. Yeah.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your own personal journey. As mentioned in your bio, you're a second-generation Canadian. Your parents immigrated to Canada from Ghana. You've said in interviews that you often felt divorced from the general social fabric of this country. What did that divorce look like when you were growing up?
That feels like a very strong word, divorce. I think of that statement.
Or that disconnection.
I think that definitely was alive for me growing up. As I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and I've just been watching the election from last week and tearing my hair out a bit. But I felt very much growing up in Calgary that I really wanted to be, I guess, a part of the social fabric. Like, my siblings and I would put on our Stetsons and our cowboy boots and head down to the rodeo, every Calgary Stampede, and we were very much, I'm sure we were a sight, but, very much wanting to be part of these kind of cultural touchstones and to share those. But we also had a very strong sense that, we physically looked very different from, and this is like Calgary in the 80s, which I understand it's different now, but this was a very homogenous culture. And, there are others who would deny you your sense of belonging and your sense of just being a fellow citizen moving through the society, together as one. And so that was something that I think is...
How would they deny you?
Well, just obviously you don't look like your average Albertan, and therefore, you're a target for so many things that people want to project on you. But, having said that, I still feel like a very strong sense of, I guess, Canadianness, for lack of a better term. This was something that slowly dawned on me when I spent a ton of time living in Europe. And, I lived in Germany for over a year, and I was in Hungary and all these different places. And I think maybe searching for a sense of belonging and home, only to realize that this is very much my home, and I'm, very much from Western Canada, and that's who that's who I am. That's what makes up my identity, as well as this sort of shadow world of Ghana and my parents' culture, which obviously, was expressed in our home in food and in different sort of cultural touchstones. But I think that's very much this feeling of being kind of outside of the narrative is what has given me my desire, I think, to write narratives of people who are outside of the main narrative.
Do you feel like, well, you kind of just mentioned it, but do you think that as time has gone on, and also as recognition for your work has increased, do you feel that that disconnect has healed a little bit, or do you feel more connected to the country?
I think I feel more, I don't think it has anything to do with the novels and how things have played out like that. I think it's just getting older. I'm old now. I should be a little bit wiser. And just having, so, you know, and I live in British Columbia now, and I felt much more connected to British Columbia than I felt to Alberta, and this is still my feeling when I go and visit Alberta. I understand that it's, in one sense, it's home, but I also understand that I've, you know, now basically lived in BC longer than I lived in Alberta, and it feels very much, and my children were both born in British Columbia, and my husband is from there, and so it's like I've been able to construct a home for myself that feels, you know, safe and good, and I belong in it.
There's this common myth in film and literature that every story has already been told. However, your work challenges that by finding inspiration in what I read, I think you articulated in an interview as the historical footnotes that have received so little attention. How do you, and I'm kind of asking because I want to steal this, but how do you find these footnotes, and how do you go from footnotes to a full novel?
Yeah, I think you find the footnotes just from reading, and sometimes they're literal footnotes. In the case of something like Half-Blood Blues, it was the fact that I had lived in Germany and was passing through German society as a black woman who had a very rudimentary knowledge of German, and what that was like for me. You know, I started to wonder about the history of black people in Germany, and that's where Half-Blood Blues emerged, is, you know, that there were so many, I guess, different kinds of blackness in Germany. So people would come from, who'd been living there for, you know, since the 1700s, who'd come over from Europe, come over from Africa as either guests of the, you know, the king, the Prussian king, or as gifts for various aristocrats. And then there were yes, gifts.
Wow, guests or gifts, wow.
Yeah. And then also, you know, men and women who had been born between the wars, to colonial soldiers from French colonies. And then there were, I hear a bell. Does that mean I have to stop? I'll finish up. And then, you know, just men who had come from America as soldiers, as American soldiers, liberating soldiers, who had decided to stay and make their lives there. And there were just so many different ways of being black in Germany, and I was curious to depict some of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can notify we have one more question that I can ask, and then we'll go to audience. Oh, okay. Oh.
Sure. Okay.
Mics and things. So we're living in these very politically trying times, I think. Maybe some other people agree. Your novels have all taken place in historic periods, but you've also talked in interviews about the sense that we're currently at a point of regression as a society. How does the current context, or how do you think your writing maybe it gets changed or impacted by the times we live in? And you kind of lightly alluded to this a moment ago.
Yeah, I think, you know, we are living in times of regression. I think so many of the strides made by the civil rights movement are, you know, are being undone, or there's an attempt to undo so much progress. And
yeah, someone's phone or something going
yes,
on.
And I think every novelist who is engaged, like who writes, I guess, material that could be called, could be said to be engaging on a political or a social level, I think you do fret and worry that you aren't really making a contribution, or that you're at your desk in a closed room all day, sort of imagining these lives. And I think you feel a great guilt about that, about not being out there and socially active and actually doing, rather than imagining. But I think that, and I know I've remarked upon this in other places, that one of the things that fiction can do that we don't sort of get in other, say in, well, I guess there's journalism that rises to the level of art, but one of the things that fiction does, and the work that it can do in the world, is to bring the reader so closely into the psyche of a character that the reader can start to fully empathize with this person, and to go through their journey with them and try and understand some of the ways in which his or her own life is like the main characters, or if it's not like the main characters, then at least to feel some sense of sadness for their trials, or joy for their triumphs. Like the fact that you're being invited so closely into a psyche, like this can be transformative, I think. To understand the plight of somebody who's not yourself is huge. And so in that sense, I think fiction is necessary.
Yeah, it's one of the most intimate ways that we can connect, right? So you just said something that made me think of something, and I've completely lost it, so I will go back to this. It was discussed that this is becoming a television series. Congratulations. And you are going to be the executive producer as well, is what I read, which is awesome. Why did you feel first? Actually, I just want to know, what's it like when people are bidding over your work? How does that feel?
No, it's good. I mean, I think a bid for movie rights feels different than a bid for the actual book, which I think when people are bidding over whether they'd like to publish your novel, it feels very personal when there's a rejection, or when you feel like somebody really wants it, it sort of buoys you along. But a bidding war for film rights, it feels like something other than, it's all good, and everybody wants it. So, yeah, that was good.
Why did you choose to take on the role of executive producer instead of, which a lot of writers do, just kind of sell the rights over?
Yeah, I think, I'm somebody who's always been interested in understanding different art forms, and I was particularly interested in screenwriting and in how things transition from, a novel, which is something that's very much contained within the two pages of the cover, to something that's very visual, and I'm interested in the difference between those modes of expression, and so I guess the chance to sit in the writer's room is very tempting.
And if you need any other writers. And so, have you guys started? I was wanting to know, how's the adaptation process been for you? What has this experience been like, opening in this door into this new world in this new form?
Yeah, well, it was just, I think the auction ended just a few months ago.
Yeah, so it's super fresh.
But I was in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago for the book festival, and then managed to sit down with everybody who's involved in this and talk to the producers and the writer and the director, and it was really lovely to have that opportunity and to hear what their vision would be.
And since we're just, all friends here and we can just talk, I know you can't tell us anything, and it's so early, so obviously these decisions haven't been made, but if you could create your dream cast of actors, and I'm going to give you so much leeway, they could be dead or alive, like we are dreaming here, to be cast as Wash, Titch, and Big Kit, who would your dream cast be?
Oh my gosh.
Dead or alive? Like, I'm giving you so much room here.
You know, I think that's a hard question for a literary writer to answer because, you know, the characters are so much your creation and you pour so much of yourself into it that it becomes really difficult to picture somebody else stepping into the role, which is also why I intend to kind of sit back and watch them work. But I think I can probably answer for Wash.
Okay.
Did you see Barry Jenkins' Moonlight?
Of course.
Yeah.
Stephen
Okay.
James? Sorry, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so the young man.
He's
Yeah, I thought he'd
Canadian,
be
guys.
perfect.
He's
Is he?
Canadian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Stephen
he'd be
James.
perfect. But as for the other two, I can't dig into
Stephen, call
some.
your agent. No, that's great. That's wonderful. Okay, so there have been some audiences, particularly in Black communities, who have expressed some fatigue over stories of slavery. What do you think that Washington Black will bring to the screen that we have yet to experience or to see?
I think this idea that I've tried to express about the life afterwards, because I think you're right. We've seen a lot of what slaves' lives, but it's like usually American.
It's true.
Enslavement again.
Yeah.
Like I can't actually think of a movie in which we have a very clear idea of what slavery looked like on Barbados. Like
I don't know of one.
Yeah.
Maybe there is, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so there's that aspect as well, but also this idea of what it meant to build a life afterwards, I think is something that I haven't seen on screen. So, yeah.
Yeah. You won the Giller Prize twice. That's a big deal. What does it mean to you to have won it twice? And I was actually in the room yelling your name, but we didn't know each other at the time, so it's okay. This time around.
I was astonished. Well, both times I was pretty surprised. Half-Blood Blues had such a ridiculously difficult time being published, so it felt like a real victory, an unexpected victory. And this time around, I didn't expect to win because I had won for my previous novel, Half-Blood Blues, and so I was just happy to be shortlisted. And so I was shocked and ill-prepared, but it feels huge for me. I think afterwards, you know, when you're doing this sort of interview scrum, I had a young woman who said that a young Black woman come up and say that she felt like seeing, especially that second win, she just felt hugely buoyed by it and more empowered to write, and that was big for me. I felt that was one of those great life moments where you just feel like this is totally worth it. Yeah.
I kind of hate the term role model, but how do you see your role in terms of this larger conversation around being a Black Canadian author from the West Coast, as you often make sure people remember it's the West Coast. But what does that role mean for you in terms of inspiring other younger and up-and-coming creatives and writers?
As I was saying, it's huge. It's not something that I think about when I'm going through my daily life or when I'm sitting down to write. That's not why I'm writing. But certainly as something that comes out of that writing, it's huge for me. Yeah, I can't overstate how privileged and honored I feel to occupy that role, because certainly when I was growing up in Calgary, thinking that I'd like to write, I didn't feel like I had a lot of role models of people who looked like me and came from where I was from, who were writing books. So yeah, it's big.
Which is powerful, the fact that you're doing it, because I think for some folks, we kind of need to see it in order to know that we can be it, and so for you to have not seen it and still be it, which is pretty amazing. So far, your work has really focused on these very exceptional Black men, these Black geniuses, which I'm totally cool with, but I heard a rumor that the next book might have a female protagonist. Is this something you can confirm or deny?
I can confirm. But having said that, I'm going to defend the fact that I've written from a male perspective.
I'm okay with it. Yeah,
but this
please.
has been something where certain people have attacked me on this, and I feel like it's very, increasingly we're living in times where there's a desire for people to only write from their personal experience. And, you know, I was on a panel, for instance, in Los Angeles a few weeks ago in which, you know, there was a Caucasian man who'd written about the Korean War, but he hadn't written about it through an Asian perspective. It was still through a white man's perspective, but it was all, but, you know, the white man wasn't a savior character. He was very conscious of what he was doing. And then there was another writer who'd also written about the Korean War, and she was a young Korean-American woman. And there was an audience member who just took umbrage with the fact that both of them were writing about the Korean War. You know, he didn't like that a white male writer would take this as his material, and he also didn't like that a young, you know, ostensibly wealthy, or at least middle class, you know, Korean American woman would take this as her material either, who didn't, you know, necessarily speak the very specific dialects.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I just thought, that's insane. You know, have we really come to a place where we're only allowed to write out of our very specific and narrow experiences? And I hope not. I hope that people are, you know, writers should be encouraged to be as creative and as expansive as they can be, though I understand that there are issues with appropriation of voice. And I get that, and I feel that those are very real issues. But I feel like we still should be having a dialogue about this, and also allow people to express stories that aren't maybe, you know, narrowly from their existence. Like if I had to write books about young girls growing up in Calgary in the 1980s, and this was the only material that I was allowed to source, I just wouldn't write.
Right.
I just give up.
Do you feel in your literary world, in your imagination, that the world is your oyster, that you could write anything, or do you have some limitations that you set for yourself in terms of how far you go or where you go?
I guess I don't really think of myself as imposing limitations upon my material. But I also realize that I write in part out of my experience as a Black person moving through the world. And that I feel like my work will always be about what it means to be Black moving through the world. But, you know, I don't feel restricted in writing only Black Canadian stories, and I never have. I'm interested in the whole diaspora of stories out there, and that's the work that I have to do.
So what's next?
People ask me, oh, what are you working on now? And I say, I'm working on getting through my book tour.
You're like just another date on the tour.
I've got, you know, I'm making sort of sketches here and there and taking notes, but I don't really have any, I haven't done any firm writing on anything. That'll come.
That was actually my last question.
All the questions we had in mind, but we did promise that we would have.
That was actually my last one.
I mean, you've done such a good job. I don't know if there are any questions out there, but we did promise, and we do like to keep our promises. So if we could just, where are the mics? I see one here, and we're going to, you know, I hate to stop you.
You didn't. That was the last one. You were perfect timing.
Well, I could sense that, but I just, okay, so I'm going to try and keep some kind of order here. So where's the first?
So we have mics. There's a mic. There's a person over here that has a.
Do you see?
Mic.
Is that?
Yep.
Is
There's
that
someone,
okay?
There's someone who has a question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Obviously, I'm going to have to reread the novel again because I've got all these new perspectives. My question relates to the fact that Washington Black is a prodigy and is exceptional and seems to go through the journey he goes through because he's exceptional in some ways. And most people aren't exceptional. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts on how generalizable this journey is for the non-exceptional, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, I think it goes back to, you were discussing slave narratives and there being, us working our way through a certain kind of narrative.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I read when I was writing Washington Black was Equiano's Travels.
Mm-hmm. Olude Equiano,
Yeah, and his life was extraordinary.
It was.
He became an abolitionist in England, but en route to that, he had basically paid for his freedom by working on these naval ships, and he was one of the first Black people ever to go north, and I guess it's an exceptional narrative about a man who is exceptional, but he's also, there's something very human about him. And, so I sort of wanted to parallel that narrative and for there to be, sort of this grand, these grand goings on, but that Washington is ultimately a fragile human being at the end of this all. But then to speak a little bit about the exceptionability, I think that's partly the point, is the fact that we don't know of those many lives that were lost who was exceptional. That there could have been, obviously there had to be so many gifted people whose lives were sort of cruelly conditioned this way, and then they were murdered or they died in terrible ways. And the fact that we're missing these details of exceptionalism is really the point of the book. But that's also not to say that he's not a human being with his failings as well.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yeah, there's somebody right here.
So I've taught both Half-Blood Blues and just this past semester Washington Black, and there was a fascinating reaction that a lot of my students had, which is both of those novels end with profound moments of ambiguity, which I really love about them. They didn't love it. And I remember that from being an undergraduate to some extent. You expect resolution. You've been taught the rising action, denouement, and whatnot structure. But I was pleased to hear you talk about the idea that you really like the aftermath of things. And I was wondering sort of if you could talk about how that focus on the aftermath relates to then endings, I guess this is a non-spoiler spoiler, endings that don't really end a story, how those two things relate.
I haven't really heard that about Half-Blood Blues. Like most people feel like, that one's tied up, so that's interesting to me. But certainly Washington Black, there is a sense of, you don't get something that's neatly tied up in a bow, or like you're saying, like that Freytag pyramid, which you learn when you do writing school, that there's the rising action and the climax, the denouement. I sort of feel like that's not really representative of life. We don't get these perfectly tied up endings. But for me, there's always a feeling of, in both of those endings, like that there's been an emotional turn, or that a question has been answered within the character that isn't necessarily physically depicted on the page. In Washington's case, okay, I can't spoil the details, but
I mean, we've spoiled quite a bit.
but he ends up in a foreign place that's completely, unlike anywhere he's been before, but that's close to what he thinks of as being his true home, his ancestral home. And he's just come to a place where he's wanted answers from Titch, and he's been wanting them for so long throughout the book, but then he realizes that he won't get the answers that he's been looking for. And you begin to realize that it's impossible for him to get, a pat answer to these questions of his whole existence. And so the answer for him is to recognize that there are no answers that lay outside of him, that he's got to answer these questions of his origins for himself. And that's the resolution that happens at the end of the book, and then it ends. And he's still physically in a place that's totally alien to him, and you don't know what he will choose to do with his life, but you understand that there's been that turn, or that emotional adjustment, and that he can't continue to search. So that it's like this emotional gesture that's been going on through the latter half of the book, that comes to an end. And I think it's just that, that's life. You can't end a book by, and then he finally found freedom. He discovered what it was for himself, and he ended up in a great place, and he opened a shoe store, and then that was, you don't get those kinds of endings in life. And so I don't feel that they belong in literature.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah?
Well,
Are you heading to a mic? I think.
Can I just say it with my very loud voice?
I think because they're taping, they wanted it to be on mic. Don't worry, guys, I got you. Thank you.
And I think we'll make this the last question.
Thank you for writing. Thank you for writing. I finished Washington Black, I closed it, and I started it again. Can you talk about the octopus a little bit?
For those that haven't read it, they're like, wait, what? There's an octopus too?
Yeah, so at one point in the novel, Wash is asked to do a shallow sea dive to get some specimens for an exhibition that they're hoping to mount in England of marine life. And he ends up, spoiler. He ends up capturing this really rare octopus, which is just the most miraculous experience that he's had in his life to date, to be under the water and to see this creature, and then to have it swim directly into his hands. And so he's really reluctant to kill it and to pin it down and bring it as a sort of pickle it and bring it back as a specimen to England. And so it's what starts his whole idea about building an aquarium, or a series of aquaria and terrariums to present live specimens as opposed to dead ones, which is what Goff, who's his scientific colleague of a sort, had planned to do. And I think there's a real affinity between him and the octopus. It becomes something symbolic for him. It's this constantly shifting creature who's camouflaging itself to match its environments just as a way of maintaining a kind of safety. And this is something that he has tried to do throughout his life, is to change himself, to try and better fit into a society where he will never fit in. He will always remain a stranger. And so there's this real affinity established, and he wants to save the animal rather than to kill it.
But it's dying when you try to
No, it starts to die much later. It's not dying when you taps that. Yeah. Spoiler. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite we're just beginning to try to express gratitude to you both for a very special evening. And I'd like to invite someone very special, the president of the Black Student Network at McGill, to say a few words on our behalf. So Christelle Tasono, please come up.
Ms. Edugyan and Ms. Parris, please accept our sincere gratitude for the engaging discussion you've allowed us to partake in this evening. It was fascinating to hear about your work and your experiences. What you've shared with us this evening has enlightened us and changed us for the better, and for that we are grateful. As a token of our appreciation and in the hopes of welcoming you again at McGill, please accept these gifts.
Thank you, Christelle. And I think I speak for everyone when I say this has been such a special evening where you really have, I mean, we felt that we were listening into a conversation of old friends talking about important things, and there's no question that your work is transformative. You talked about wanting it to be, and I'm sure it is and it will be, and we're going to look forward to your body of work as it develops. So congratulations to you on all the achievements you've already made and to all the ones to come. And thank you so much, Amanda. It was just fantastic. You're just as good in person as you are on the radio, and you're both fantastic. Now, Esi is going to be signing books on your way out. I hope we have enough, and then we're going to whisker away. But you have a little bit of time to sign some books. That's still a possibility.
Yes.
And thank you so much.
Happy to.
Thank you. Have a good
So
evening.
lovely. Thank you.
See you next time.
If I'm able to sign up, I'll purchase the book. So